Hey guys, I'm back again with another mixing session and pour for the Colorful Reptile series. In these videos, I've pulled palettes of colors from photos of reptiles. I then take these colors and use them as a guide while I mix custom nature-inspired acrylics to use in paint pouring. Today I'm working with the colors of the common collared lizard. In the last video, we talked a bit about pigment codes and the valuable information that can be gathered from knowing them. To do a quick recap, most student and artist grade pigments have these codes listed on the bottle. Pigment codes represent the actual pigment that is being used in that bottle of paint. Take phthalo blue with a pigment code of PB15. If you look at some of the bottles of phthalo blue, you will notice that it isn't always just PB15. It can have variations. PB15-3, for instance, is phthalo blue green shade, while PB15-6 is phthalo blue red shade. Artist grade pigments are going to have this distinction pretty clearly, but you may have to search a bit more on the student grade to figure out which shade is being used. Each pigment has a purpose in mixing. If you add the PB15-3, expect a greenish tint to the final color. PB15-6, the color will have more of a reddish tint. Having a better understanding about the pigments that you're working with will help you better decide which ones to use while you mix. Now, you may have asked yourself, what kind of acrylic paint should I use? Well, if you notice, I use a pretty wide variety of types. So, what's the difference? Both artist and student grades of acrylic paint are going to use the same type of base pigments because, well, that's all there is to use. The pigment types themselves are not changing through the grades, except when pigments are too expensive. Then hues are used. The pigment load, on the other hand, is going to be different. Cheaper paints are going to have fewer pigment particles suspended in the binder. Again, it's the same basic type of pigment being used across the grades, just in varying quantities. The second difference is going to be the quality of the binder used to hold the pigment together. Acrylic paints are an emulsion of acrylic polymers and pigment. The synthetic polymers are meant to mimic natural latex. That's why you will occasionally see paints labeled as latex paints. There isn't any true natural latex in the paint. It's referring to the latex-like polymer being used as the binder. Okay, so why does the binder make such a difference? Better quality binders last longer, but they also provide better protection against color shift. If you're familiar with acrylic pouring, especially for those of you that have used Floetrol as a pouring medium, you have probably noticed how dull your acrylics look once you add in the medium. Paints that start out deep and dark tend to lighten up a bit when the pouring medium is added, only to darken back up again when they dry. This is due to the binder being used. Binders usually have a slightly milky white appearance to them. Even though they dry clear, while they're wet, it's changing the way the light is able to interact with the pigment. Once the binder dries to clear, it's no longer blocking the light, and the pigment particles have moved back in closer together. This causes the paints to turn out darker than they originally looked when wet. Artist grade pigments tend to have binders that start off clearer than student grades. Since these binders are already almost see-through while they are wet, you will have less of a color shift when dry. In other words, you can get more exact in your color matching when using artist grade paints because what you see while mixing is the color it will be when dry. If you're using a student grade or craft paint, you may want to mix a step lighter than what you want it to dry as. When you look at acrylic mediums, you are essentially seeing the binders before pigment is added. Acrylic mediums can be used to alter paints in a variety of ways. I use acrylic gel medium all the time while mixing. Since I work with a variety of different paint viscosities, I'm able to use the gel medium to help keep the same consistency through my mix, even when I'm using fluid acrylics. Since mediums are just variations of binder, the more you add, the smaller your pigment load gets. So while I add in gel medium to help with consistency, it is changing up the pigment load slightly. I have found that the amount that I use does not drastically change any color or transparency. Once you start getting to the point where the medium outweighs the pigment, you begin to create what are called glazes, washes, and stains. These amounts drastically change the pigment load, so colors will typically be lighter variations of themselves. Add enough of a medium to paint, and even the most opaque colors can become transparent. Also, keep in mind that only gloss mediums are going to dry clear. Matte, satin, and other finishes have extra matting solids in the mix. This causes the medium to be hazier and will not dry 100% clear like gloss. While adding these other mediums will give you a slight change to the sheen of your dried paint, you would need to add excessive amounts to get it to fully switch over. At that point, you would have more medium than pigment. I also do not recommend using anything but clear medium for things such as mica and interference. The extra matting solids in the other mediums will hinder how much light reaches the mica particles within the suspension. Clear binder creates more opportunity for light to shine through and refract off the pigment particles. So we now know the biggest difference in student and artist grade acrylic paints are pigment load and the quality of binder used. What about all the other different variations you have to choose from? Artists have quite a few choices when it comes to acrylic paints. Heavy body, fluid, open, interactive, the options seem endless. Again, the main thing here is going to be the binder used to hold the pigment together. Heavy body and fluid have the same approximate pigment load, but the binders that are being used to hold them together are different consistencies. Open acrylics have a binder that is formulated to be more like oil paint. Instead of drying quickly like other acrylics, this binder allows a slower dry time, giving you more time to work with it. Interactive acrylic paints dry like regular paints, but the binder used allows them to be re-wetted to be worked with again. Acrylic gouache paints use a binder that dries matte and opaque like traditional gouache, but it also becomes water resistant when dry. Craft paints have the cheapest binder and the lowest pigment loads. The binder that's used in craft paint is typically vinyl or PVA based, similar to what's used in white glue. Really, the answer to which type of paint to use is whichever one makes you happy. Artist grade paints will have the largest selection of colors and consistencies available, but are the most expensive. Student grade are a great middle ground of having mixable colors, a pretty standard consistency, and decent price. Craft grade paints will have a lot of color selection and are the cheapest. Most craft paints are already mixed pigment colors though, so they aren't the best for mixing, but can definitely be used. There isn't really a right or wrong answer to which paints should be used for acrylic pouring. Most can be modified in some way or another to be used in a pour. Heavy bodies can be thinned, craft paints can be thickened, and everything can be experimented with. When I go to buy new paints, the color of the paint in the tube is the first thing that catches my eye. From there, I'll look at what pigments are being used to make that paint. Is this a mixture of pigments or is it pure? I try to keep this in mind when I look at other colors that might mix well with it. I pay slightly less attention to the transparency of the paints, but I do try to take it into consideration. I recently heard something that made me giggle. If you can't pronounce the name of the pigment, it's probably transparent. If it sounds more natural in name, then it's most likely opaque. I had to laugh because every time I've had to look up the pronunciation for a pigment, it's been for a transparent color. Most of the transparent colors are going to come from synthetic dyes and pigments, so the names are based on the chemical makeup. Most opaque colors are going to come from natural pigments. If you take a stone and grind it up, it may reflect more light at that point, but it's still going to block most of the light from going through. these pigments are going to naturally have more covering power. So color by sight, color by code, and transparency are the top things I look at when buying acrylic paint. Once you start looking closely, you're going to notice that paints that are labeled with the same color code can be named differently across brands. Phthalo Blue PB15 can be found under Winsor & Newton brand as Winsor Blue, but under Blick Acrylics, it's known as Primary Blue. I'm not saying that these are all going to be the exact same colors across the board. Yes, they use the same base pigment, but each brand has its own binder formulas and ways of processing pigments, so there will be slight variations from brand to brand on the final color. You may also run into the same pigment code being used with different names within a brand as well. Some pigments can be processed in various ways to change the final color outcome. So they're using the same raw materials, just processed differently to change the hue up. Alright, so to recap, buy whatever paint you want, use it however you want. Each paint brand or type is going to have its own pros and cons. You may find a color that you absolutely fall in love with in a craft line. Just because it isn't artist grade paint doesn't mean that it can't create beautiful art. Snatch that color up! Need it thicker? Add in some gel medium. Love the color but want it to be slightly lighter? Throw in a bit of titanium white or gray to lighten or tone the color down. Just be mindful of your additions without knowing the starting pigments. The final mix of acrylic and pouring medium being the same consistency through the colors is more important in a pour than the type of paint used itself. Since all pigments weigh different amounts, keeping the same fluid consistency across all of the mixes lets the pigments do the work versus the weight of the medium moving them around. Having the same consistency also helps prevent cracks and crazing while the canvas dries as well. That's going to be it for me today. I hope I was able to give you a bit of useful information to put into play on your next paint buying trip. I'll be back with these colors again in the next video. I have to say, the next pour is another one of my favorites from the series, so make sure you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!